then...
Yeah, that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
So let's talk for a second about sort of the necessity for Judeo-Christian revelation, because, and here I'm going to merge the two in terms of the idea of God personally speaking to people and giving them the morality of the Old Testament, which largely is reflected in the New Testament. And the New Testament is part of the Old Testament, according to Christians anyway. It reflects the chief morality of the Old Testament. It doesn't supplant it entirely. The Old Testament doesn't become a nothing just because the New Testament comes around. So that's why I'm now moving back toward the kind of theological question, which is, what's the purpose of the revelation? Meaning, would it be sufficient to work within the framework of the first half of our conversation with regard to sort of rational pushes, not toward revelation and the presence of God in human form in Christianity, or the presence of God on top of a mountain in Judaism? Would a God of reason alone be sufficient? Or do you need to have, for what purpose do you need to have a God who is speaking directly to people at Sinai or speaking through Jesus in Christianity?
I think that the answer of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament can be put into one word: atonement. What is needed is atonement for sin. And in the Levitical sacrifices, in the tabernacle and later in the temple, you had a sacrificial system whereby atonement was made for sin through the sacrifice of various animals. And Jesus himself and the authors of the New Testament think of Jesus as being the ultimate sacrificial offering to God to make atonement once and for all for the sins of mankind, so that in his sacrificial death on the cross, he fulfills all of these Jewish antecedents or foreshadowing of a decisive atonement for sin that will reconcile us to God and bring forgiveness and pardon and cleansing.